Regulated.
This podcast focuses on regulatory and corporate developments in highly regulated spaces. I'm Christian Bax, and I used to regulate medical marijuana.
I'm Tony Glover, and I formerly regulated alcoholic beverages and casino gambling. Now, we're regulated.
We're transitioning into a weekly release schedule where we address the most interesting stories affecting investors, operators, and advocates in the marijuana, alcohol, and casino gaming space. And so today we're going to jump right into Tony's first story, which is out of Utah.
Yeah, thanks, Christian. I saw a story from Marijuana Business Daily back on August 22nd. I thought it was worth discussing in light of some of our previous conversations on the pod. The article title is Utah Lawmakers Consider Ditching a State-Run Medical Cannabis System. And I've got a few lines I'd like to share from that. Utah legislators are drafting a proposal to scrap the planned state-run medical marijuana dispensary system and instead will increase the number of private facilities, which should boost business opportunities and sales. Lawmakers are considering the change after facing pressure from county attorneys who said the system put public employees at risk of being prosecuted under federal drug laws. The law now calls for 7 private cannabis pharmacies with a state-run central fill pharmacy that will distribute the remainder of medical marijuana orders through Utah's 13 local health departments. The law now calls for 7 private cannabis pharmacies with a state-run central fill pharmacy that will distribute the remainder of medical marijuana through Utah's 13 local health departments. Under the proposal, according to the Republican Senate Majority Leader, medical cannabis would instead be distributed through up to 12 private dispensaries. I think this is really interesting. I think Christian and I both indicated on the podcast a bit of reluctance about state-run cannabis, state-run businesses. And I think the impact of this is really threefold. One, the most obvious thing, we're really narrowly avoiding another state-run business in America. The reports out of Utah make it clear that the officials, both state and local, were pretty uncomfortable handling the situation, which is understandable. And it sounds like the state officials were a bit uncomfortable with the idea of running the business. What do you think, Christian?
So, I'm a little disappointed because Utah is a pretty politically and demographically a homogenous state. And it's a pretty red state. And so, I mean, if there's one state in the country that at this moment that I thought would actually be a pretty interesting laboratory for that kind of policy, it would have been Utah. And so, how do you feel, though? How is your regulatory heartburn as Utah seems to be moving away from a state-centric model?
Look, it's an uncomfortable situation. You look at how risk-averse state employees are by nature. And it's understandable. You spend some time under the fire, you realize, sometimes you have a choice between being aggressive in your job or keeping your job, right? And in this context, for you to continue your state career, you're potentially committing violations of federal law and potentially putting yourself at jeopardy. Look, there's been continued conversations or discussions from the Trump administration, including the president himself just last week, stating that, marijuana regulation is really up to the states. But, as we've seen when Attorney General Sessions came in, there's always a chance for a future political appointee by this president or by a future president at Department of Justice that changes that. So I completely understand. I'd be extremely uncomfortable if I was a Utah public servant that was being put in charge of substantial corporate activities related to cannabis. They don't pay enough for that. It is what it is.
Now, I may have missed this in your description, but so is the central fill completely gone? So is it going to be completely through a privatized distribution network, or is there still going to be kind of a safety net state distribution system where the dispensaries aren't covering?
Yeah, it sounds like there will be that safety net system, and they're going to operate out of the local health departments. run by the state. So it sounds like it's a dispensary of last resort. It's an interesting hybrid system. So there still will be some state involvement, but they're not going to be. It sounds like they're not going to be responsible for carrying the bulk of the commerce.
Right. So it seems like it begs the question. So does the state just not want to be out front? They're okay still being wedded to the program and still the legal jeopardy, if there is any, is still there, right? It seems like they're trying to mitigate the risk a bit, but this does not seem to have eliminated the risk that they seem to be wanting to avoid.
Right, I agree. This is probably aggressive mitigation, but it's not alleviation, right?
So let me tell you one other thought I had about this and why I was a little disappointed, right? One of the sneaky elements of cannabis regulation that doesn't really get a lot of play unless you're actually in the industry or serving the industry is the involvement of local government. And a lot of local governments, especially more rural or conservative areas, are not fans of medical marijuana or of its sister program of a recreational program. And you have ordinances, you have bans, you have moratoriums, you have a lot of levers that local governments can pull if they don't think that their constituency is in favor of a medical marijuana program. And my thinking in a state like Utah was that you're going to run into issues frequently with their local governments in zoning, and that when you now privatize it, it's good for the economics in the private sector, but at the same time, those private businesses are now going to individually have to deal with local governments, whereas it seems like the state going into a state like Utah would have a little bit more oomph with the program, kind of getting local governments to toe the line and allow for an expansion of a medical marijuana program.
Well, look, one of the other points I was going to mention that I think is potentially impactful is that there is going to be a special session, according to the Governor Herbert, over in Utah. So it's going to be interesting to see what legislation comes out of that process, because we've seen in the alcoholic beverage world, Utah laws are just, they're tough to deal with. I mean, they've been still having a discussion about allowing full strength beer in the state of Utah. It's 2019. So if you look at the way that they treat malt beverages in the state, I can't imagine that there's going to be a ton of comfortable, friendly, regulatory attorney friendly loopholes in this new Utah legislation that comes out. But yeah, I think it's probably a great time to be a lobbyist and a regulatory attorney in Utah. And early shout out to that group coming into a special session. Your billables would be great. Congratulations.
So there's one other thing, Tony, that I'm watching real closely, and that's perception. And the reason I say perception is because you have this really interesting dichotomy that's developed between Colorado and Utah, where a big chunk of Utah's economy is tourism, and a big chunk of that tourism is skiing, snowboarding, is mountain sports. And over the past decade, you've had this bifurcation between Colorado and Utah, where Colorado is kind of seen as the younger, hipper kind of destination, almost like a Vegas for skiing, whereas Utah is seen as, Disney World. It's the more conservative, it's the more family-friendly, and they've kind of leaned into that. They've embraced that. And so you're going to have people in the state of Utah who very much do not want to give an inch on the perception that they would be moving away from like a family-friendly Disney approach to just kind of their culture, to their society. And this is a limited medical marijuana program, but you do have naysayers out there that see any movement in that direction as a negative.
And that's all perception. I mean, we can pull all those boogeymen out of the closet for any issue. And, and there's a perfect family-friendly example in our home state that we can look at, which is Orlando. And there's a few sort of major events that have happened over the past 25 years that we can compare it to. But I would guess that if we looked at the track of Orlando tourism and revenues at Disney resorts and things of that nature, I suspect that the implementation of medical marijuana in Florida has had no impact. There's certainly no negative impact on that number. So I would tell our friends in Utah to chill out a little bit. I'm pretty sure that a family that's looking to visit Utah from Pennsylvania or from the state of Washington isn't going to be alarmed by an extraordinarily conservative medical marijuana regime, especially when you consider that the state that they're coming from probably has a more liberal system. And when you look at the polling behind this number, not only does that state probably have a more liberal system, the visitor probably approves of it. So it's not a big deal. Calm out. Orlando survived. Utah will survive.
It seems like the government in Utah is a little reticent for this program, and I point that out just because the Salt Lake City or the Salt Lake Tribune had an article recently I was reading up on before this podcast, and it was a very interesting move that Utah made on cultivation licenses, where they initially had 10 licenses that were available. They had 81 applicants for those 10 licenses. So a few months later, when they award their licenses, they award 8. And the regulator, in a statement, said that they chose to issue 8 instead of 10 to avoid an overabundance of cannabis. So, like, can you imagine something like that happening, where you have a limited license cycle up to 10 licenses, and they cut 20% of the licenses because they don't want an overabundance of licensees? And so it tells me Utah is not there. This is going to be a pretty limited program. And kind of while we're on the topic of boogeymen kind of hiding in the closet, there's one other really interesting boogeyman that's especially impactful for a state like Utah, again, where skiing and mountain sports are so important, and a lot of the population like lives in the mountains. Is, there are 122 ski areas that operate nationally and that are on public land. And so many of the ski resorts up in Utah operate on land that's owned by the National Forest System, which means they're owned by the federal government. Obviously, marijuana is federally illegal, and so you run into a legal gray area where you don't necessarily have the same state protections for a medical marijuana program because you're operating on federal land. And I've seen that used, on the message boards, in when you kind of look in Utah and you kind of dig around what people are kind of talking about on the ground there. And that's another lever that seems to be getting pulled, is, we don't want cannabis on federal land, even though Colorado has been experiencing this for a decade. What do you think about that?
There's certainly the potential for a challenge there, but I guess it really comes down to how zealous or overzealous those rangers and folks that work for the Park Service and USDA are going to be on federal grounds. And if they're really being serious about this and chasing down every puff of smoke and puff of vapor in the park, you could see some increased activity in that space. So that'd be interesting to see. Look, it looks like this development signals to the growing number of cannabis investors that Utah is open for business. Utah has a challenge. I mean, its population is just about equal to just Miami-Dade County, but still, with the amount of private funding that's running in this industry, I'm sure there are many that are eager for any opportunity. What do you think about Utah as a market for investors? What's the opportunity here?
I'd say it's good, not great. Anytime these multi-state operators who are building this portfolio and kind of trying to build an underlying value, especially for the public companies, they like securing these limited state licenses. The issue I really see is there's a small population of only 3 million people, and B, I mean, Utah is a big state and it's really spread out, and so you don't really have
there's
that
real logistical challenges with distributing across Utah.
Exactly, and I'm really concerned about the local government zoning and ordinances, in the sense that Utah already has, it doesn't have that bright blue dot in the middle of the state. Salt Lake City is a pretty conservative place. And then when you kind of go out and you're going out to the rural communities in Utah, which again are very spread out and don't have really large population pockets, you're going to have to do a lot of legwork to secure property in those areas that are appropriate for zoning. And I do not see a situation where, interesting, lucrative markets, towns and cities in Utah allow for kind of an abundance of cannabis facilities. And so you may have, a couple dispensaries within each city, but unless there's some kind of groundswell or some significant change, I just don't seeing dispensaries or grows or even processing facilities really being able to get a strong foothold in that state. And you look at just the political landscape for Utah, and then the last Senate race, there were only two counties in Utah, which were Grand County and Summit County. Summit County being where Park City is, which is probably one of the few blue dots in Utah. That was the only place Mitt Romney didn't get at least 50% of the vote in the last Senate election. So, and even then it was like 50.2 or 50.3s. I mean, up for the opponent. So I don't like it for the market size. I think it's going to be really difficult for the operators to get facilities. But the only way they're going to make money and be able to retain value is unless they knock it out of the park as far as capturing market share, or Utah holds on to that really strict, limited, very, very, very limited model and allows them to basically get a very strong government protected market share.
Well, and of course, the challenge with Utah is that if the regulatory structure is broken or doesn't yield the desired results, it's too hard to operate in the state. It's too hard to get product to patients that need it. If any of those issues arise, if we can learn anything from watching them grapple with antiquated alcoholic beverage regulations over the years, is that the legislature won't fix it. So if they come out of the gate with an imperfect product, it may be here to stay, and that would be unfortunate. So will be interesting to watch, and we'll circle back on this issue if anything fun happens in special session or with big name investors or MSOs coming into the state.
So now moving into another really interesting story from the last week. On September 4th, Johns Hopkins Medicine announced the launch of the Center for Psychedelic and Consciousness Research to study compounds like LSD and psilocybin for a range of mental health problems, including anorexia, addiction, and depression. This is something that Tony and I talked about in our last podcast. But it's really interesting because this study is coming with some money. The center is the first of its kind in the country, and it was established with $17 million in commitments from private donors, which is interesting because, it's something that Tony and I were talking when we were talking about in our last podcast. A lot of the studies were coming out of Johns Hopkins, and they have kind of created this foothold in the United States for giving some credibility to research into what's called psychedelic medicine. One of the reasons why this is so important is because it's seen by the people who are watching this as an opportunity for Johns Hopkins to dig deep into medical and scientific studies. And one of the issues with a lot of the news stories that we've seen about the potential of some psychedelics is the fact that the scientific evidence isn't really completely there. One of the reasons why is because dealing with psilocybin and other psychedelics, it's hard to create and execute, a peer-reviewed double-blind study. Part of that is because it's illegal. But secondly, it's kind of the drug that you're dealing with. Most scientific experiments are blind in the sense that you have you have two or more groups. One of those groups is always a control group, which is given a placebo, so that they're not impacted in any way by the study. And you use that group of participants as a baseline. And then you have this other group that is, thinks that they know that they're part of a study, but don't necessarily know that they've been given the active ingredient and believe, they could have been given the placebo. So there's a little bit of skepticism there as well. But in psilocybin, when you have it, right? There's not really disguising to a patient whether or not they have a significant dose of psilocybin in their system, especially because, these articles, some of these studies that we've been referencing where they are applying double the normal recreational dose to these patients, so they feel it. However, Johns Hopkins seems to have the resources and the personnel and, the money that they're bringing in. They're able to have 6 full-time faculty, 5 postdoc scientists, and enough money to cover their current and new studies into this area. So it seems like they're going to be able to jump that hurdle a bit and improve the scientific validity of the tests and give us all a little bit more confidence that what seems to be happening is actually happening in practical medical applications. Tony, you have anything to add to that?
Well, I have to admit I'm a little distracted by this announcement. And I want to circle back to something that you said at the beginning, which is that the first trials include, number one, potential treatment for anorexia. Number two, potential treatment for psychological distress and cognitive impairment connected to early Alzheimer's. And number three, and this is a near future trial, so I guess not officially slated yet, but they want to treat this substance to determine whether, test this substance to determine whether it affects opiate use disorder. So when I hear those three things, all I'm thinking about is dollar signs. I'm hearing $1 billion, $2 billion, $3 billion opportunity here with these trials. It's going to be really interesting to watch. And you mentioned perception before in our previous topic, and I think that's something that plays in here. This just goes, we talked about this a few weeks ago about investors considering entering this space and looking at sort of municipal governments and the federal government and which way it may go. Getting Johns Hopkins out there, really getting to the meat of it with these first trials, I think is really going to provide a lot of cover for investors and their boards and their executives at their firms who are trying to sign off on some potential funding.
And interestingly, looking where the money is coming from, so I thought this was fascinating in that $2 million of the initial startup capital for this new entity at Johns Hopkins is a man named Tim Ferriss, who is the
speaking of investors, here
right,
we go,
the entrepreneur and author behind the 4-Hour Workweek and 4-Hour Body, and he's written a lot of kind of newer, hipper self-help books. And he's definitely what I would describe as a futurist. He's someone who's kind of always looking at the next thing. And, some people love him. Some people don't love him so much. But the fact that he's involved with this, if Tim Ferriss is good at anything, it is at creating publicity and at building a brand, right? You need to look no further than his podcast, which has become very successful. His multiple New York Times best-selling books, is that now he is involved. He's basically a principal in this group, and the fact that he's brought more than 10% of their funding, and I would anticipate him becoming kind of a face and a mouthpiece for psychedelic medicine as well. And so you have, this is not going anywhere. This is the tip of the iceberg. And I think what you were saying is absolutely correct. The dollar signs are going to follow this. And and if you haven't been following the story, there are already venture capital groups and investment groups, private equity groups that have formed in order to seek out investments in psychedelics, specifically psilocybin.
Well, I want to circle back to Ferriss just for folks out there who don't understand the level of investor we're talking about. I just pulled up his wiki just to run down some of his previous activity. He's an angel investor and advisor to startups, as you mentioned. He's invested or advised in startups such as StumbleUpon, Posterous, Evernote, Daily Burn, Shopify, Reputation.com, Trippy, and TaskRabbit. He's a pre-seed money advisor to Uber. He was one of the first investors. He was pre-seed round advisor to Uber. I mean, this guy has an eye for investments, and it's clear that he also has a philanthropic, sort of a positive reason for being involved with this. I mean, I think that he's concerned about depression as an issue, and he sees this as a potential opportunity. But he's not dumb, right? He's not in the business of dumb money. He's in the business of very smart money. So I feel good that we're getting in on this, albeit in a slightly less revenue oriented manner. But I'm glad that we're getting into this at the same time that Tim Ferriss is.
Well, I mean, because you've experienced this in anything in the private sector where there's kind of there are fads, there are these kind of new waves of development and interesting new products that come and go all the time. But one of the things that that you need in order to really make a movement or create funds, create large businesses is capital, right? And these guys who have a boatload of money, I mean, they like being around interesting, cool people. They like spending their money and doing interesting, cool things, right? So you have the opportunity, some of these guys, to go talk to Tim Ferriss at Johns Hopkins about, I'm assuming, I don't know what their level of relationship. I don't know if they would give, Tim Ferriss a boardroom at Johns Hopkins to have an investor meeting. Probably wouldn't. But you have with Tim Ferriss this thing that kind of brings a little bit more interest and credibility from some of these guys who have a lot of money who are kind of courting new interesting ideas. I mean, this is a these two names together, Johns Hopkins and Tim Ferriss, both in the same story. And you notice this is a very long article in the New York Times about this. And there wasn't really any skepticism or criticism about psychedelic medicine, which is really notable.
It's so interesting to watch this issue come up, and there's more concern about medical marijuana dispensaries in certain jurisdictions in Florida than there is about major universities and major investors getting involved in psychedelics. You have seen very little activity from traditional sort of family-oriented conservative groups in DC. This is something that's on the radar of the positive side, but the opposition really hasn't seemed to form yet. And I expect that there will be opposition because this is historically, this is a pretty aggressive substance that we're talking about.
Right. And I think it's impossible to ignore the fact that that marijuana and cannabis, the cannabis market has kind of set a precedent like this. A lot of the same people that are looking at psychedelic medicine either were involved in or closely studied how cannabis developed over the last 2 decades. And one of the lessons that of kind of the age we're living in that a lot of people have learned in this space and kind of public health and drugs is that you, with stuff like this where they see an opening, always chasing that opening and blowing up that opportunity and making it as big as possible ends up paying dividends because it very rarely gets clawed back. And so if they have this opportunity to fund research and fund these programs at Johns Hopkins or any number of universities around the country, around the world, that's producing academic research. That academic research turns into stories. Those stories, influence, they get spread through social media. People read them. It starts to change the public opinion. And the faster they move through that process, the more impacts it has on public opinion. The more public opinion shifts, the more they kind of get leverage in the political sphere, which is where you need to have the legal and regulatory changes in order to create systems to monetize this stuff, to either bring it into the current medical establishment or to create kind of these niche, non-traditional medical avenues like medical marijuana kind of pioneered. I think, again, this is the beginning of what I think is going to be a pretty significant movement, because now that Johns Hopkins is involved, you can't overstate the amount of credibility that they bring to this, and it's going to be hard, if you were University of Wisconsin or University of Florida or UCLA, and you can't really poo-poo when one of your department heads comes and says, hey, I'd like to do some research into psychedelics. Look at all of this amazing work and published articles coming out of Johns Hopkins. Like, we can't let them have that corner to themselves. So let's backtrack a little bit and talk specifically about what we mean when we talk about psilocybin study. So that Johns Hopkins has kind of pioneered these studies, and they all kind of follow a very similar blueprint, where you select a participant based on the condition that they seem to be suffering from. So one of the things that we discussed on the last podcast was a study that closely tracked people who were suffering from terminal cancer. And these were people who were likely going to die from their cancer diagnosis within a year, and were suffering from profound depression and anxiety. And so these patients, like many others who are going through these, who are participants in these studies, you come in, these patients have a complete medical history, and they sit down psychologists, and they kind of talk through what their symptom is. The symptoms are. There's questionnaires. They do a very lengthy and deep psychological and medical profile of those patients. Then on treatment day, the patient will come into the office. They will take their dose of psilocybin, and frequently, they'll wear headphones with music, or they'll wear blindfolds, sometimes both, and they'll have a medical professional with them, kind of guiding them through that process and urging them to remain calm and lean deeply into what they're seeing. And generally, these patients are told to kind of be open and willing to kind of accept, almost kind of go loose without getting panicked or anxious about the effects, because they're hallucinating, and so they can be very uncomfortable and disturbing for people. And people who go through these, participants who go through these studies, when they talk about it, they're like, this wasn't just all rainbows and butterflies. This was a very existentially moving, sometimes very uncomfortable experience. But you have your doctor kind of playing the spirit guide through that experience, and they come out the other side. And the anecdotal descriptions and the descriptions from these studies that are coming out is, it seems to be that existential experience. It seems to kind of create a breakthrough with some of these patients, where they're able to kind of get outside of their issues for a little bit of time, and are able to gain some comfort from that experience. Did you see that thing about the mystical experience questionnaire?
No, but I'm about to Google it. And I assume this is no relationship to mystical of New Orleans, right?
Like the rapper? That's pretty great.
I'm real into the mystical experience question now. If it has anything to do with Fire, Neptune's produced singles from the early 2000s, count me in.
I was reading about the actual kind of practical elements of these studies.
Right.
And one finding many drug studies share is that any positive effects are far more likely if the participant has an especially intense trip. And so the intensity is subjectively graded using a variety of measures, including what scientists are called the MEQ, which stands for the Mystical Experience Questionnaire. Which I love.
This is great. I'm looking at it now. This is really interesting.
Right. And so the Mystical Experience Questionnaire is what researchers use to evaluate whether a participant has had, quote, a mystical experience. And it's loosely defined as an experience of profound unity with all that exists, a felt sense of sacredness, a sense of experience of truth and reality, fundamental level, deeply felt positive mood, transcendence of time and space, difficulty explaining the experience in words. Now, this is another drug. This is another instance of something that was not part of a kind of a legitimized medical science. And this is just kind of coming out of the woods as far as that kind of element of science is concerned. And so it seems like, you use the tools you have. And so it's funny because the Dr. Griffiths, who's the guy who's kind of running this for Johns Hopkins, was quoted as really not being a fan of calling their test the Mystical Experience Questionnaire, and thought it was not great marketing for what they're doing. But I mean, it is what it is, and it's basically when you I'll let you Google this, but when you kind of Google what the criteria are for that questionnaire, it doesn't really seem like a sterile laboratory toolkit that you would use. But I've never been through this process, so maybe the finding out experience of insight that all is one, or a sense of reverence, or a sense of awe or awesomeness, or these are probably perfectly valid questions to ask someone who's had a very significant psychological experience with psilocybin.
Well, I'm looking at the author manuscript for the Griffith study and his colleagues, and there's an interesting tidbit here, which I think maybe we had contemplated but didn't come down on a number. And I'll just read from this. Regarding contemporary use, at least 9% of U.S. adults have tried psilocybin mushrooms at least once in their lifetime.
Right,
That's
which is completely different
to me.
Right, it's
That
completely different from the published studies that we saw, that we read 3 weeks ago, which was said it was like 1% of 1%, right?
9% is a bit unbelievable to me. That's unbelievable to me.
Was it of participants or just the general population?
9% of U.S. adults.
Yeah, that does seem a bit high.
I to me, it just feels like 2% is more. It's probably more. Actually, I would probably go to 1%. Is probably a more realistic. But hey, maybe I'm not getting invited to the right parties.
Right. Right. I mean, listeners out there, people who are listening to Regulated in this podcast, if you do have more information about kind of the prevalence of psychedelic, specifically psilocybin use on the American population, we have everything we've read has said that it's extremely, extremely low. Especially compared to cannabis.
I want to stop you, Christian. I don't want anybody to contact us about mushrooms because we had a gentleman, the intern, reached out to me the other day, and we had an angry Twitter user who responded to something that the Regulated Pod on Twitter had posted. And was apparently angry because on the podcast we had discouraged people from picking wild mushrooms, and thought that we should have been more encouraging. And we did not respond to that tweet. Nor am I encouraging people to go play Russian roulette with poisonous mushrooms out in the field somewhere.
Right. And I mean, I saw that tweet. I didn't respond to it either. But my thought when I saw that was, I didn't feel like we were discouraged. I felt like it was, we were discouraging people going out and picking their mushrooms. I felt like it was more just saying that, yeah, you can go out into cow fields and pick these mushrooms, but as far as a regimented kind of medical supply chain, that's almost certainly not going to be the way that it's distributed.
Well, I feel confident. I don't think we've really expressed a political belief as it relates to mushrooms, but I feel pretty comfortable telling people that are learning about mushrooms from this podcast, please do not take the descriptions of these mushrooms and go out and try to find them in the field.
No,
it's not going to work out great.
Absolutely not. Do not do that. I agree. I don't think that I think that's just generally, I think, the tone of the show that we've chosen to go with, is that we're not super political about any of this stuff. It's more just a dissection of the regulatory issues. But we are both very excited by this because it's something that's completely new as attorneys who are both in regulated industries. Like seeing a completely new regulated industry just kind of emerging from the ether is just fascinating. You don't get to see it that much.
Right.
So with all of that said, this is something that I think is moving, but whether or not it's actually able to be monetized, as something that has mass market implications, I don't know, Tony, how do you feel about that? I'm still a little bit skeptical.
I feel like I say this every podcast, but I do mean it. One of the great things about America and our republic is that we have these 50 state laboratories. And in the context of these mushrooms, we actually have more than that, because you're seeing municipalities like Oakland that are taking steps, and municipalities in Colorado. So we're going to have a lot of laboratories to see the effects. But, one thing that gives me heartburn now is that, psilocybin does carry risk, and I do feel like some of the municipal driven regulations, or deregulation more accurately, has been perhaps too permissive, and I'm concerned that we see a few cases out of Seattle or Oakland that cause some concern, whether there's a serious health impact or a life-ending event that occurs. So that's where my heartburn comes. Are advocates for this substance, which seems to be effective in many ways to treating some medical issues, are advocates for this substance setting themselves up for failure later? And we end up with a temporary opening of this market in certain locations. We see some negative effects, and that slows down the federal operation that needs to be running concurrently to ease some of the federal restrictions. So that's where my heartburn is now. But again, we have a laboratory, and we'll get to see the results.
And I think that there's going to be the natural kind of progression of information, and that goes along with a lot of new industries. And one of the kind of seedier parts of getting new information out there and in new industries is, you're going to start seeing, if you haven't already, the airport Ramada Inn seminars on psilocybin, how to make a quick buck in psychedelics, and those are going to start popping up, and I have a little heartburn about. So when you have these local governments that are decriminalizing the possession and sale of a Schedule I drug, obviously cannabis has taught the U.S. population something kind of new, which is if there are situations where states and municipalities believe it's easier to ask for forgiveness and permission, sometimes there is an opportunity there to get involved and make money. I'm concerned that this, psychedelics is not cannabis, is not going to have the same laissez-faire approach from the federal government.
Mushrooms may not be the drug that we want to move fast and break stuff on. Cannabis, what's the worst that could happen? Somebody smokes a few too many puffs at a party and orders a Hungry Howie's pizza. But we went through some of the health impacts here with mushrooms, and this isn't an anti-mushroom rant. This is just a commentary on if there are potential adverse impacts that are statistically possible. The more unregulated and sloppy the distribution network is, the more likely you're going to see those. And as we're seeing right now, looking cross industry, there have been some lung issues and potential deaths that have occurred recently that are connected, loosely connected, but connected to vaping, or more specifically connected to vapors. Now, the causation on those cases is very questionable, right? We don't have any answers as to whether the vaping device was legal, illegal, THC, nicotine-based, et cetera, and whether it actually caused the disease. But what we do have is a bunch of articles in the New York Times and the Washington Post and the Los Angeles Times decrying unregulated vaping, and you see municipalities including San Francisco, starting to ban certain e-cigarettes and vaping devices to be sold in the municipality. So there's a high margin of error here. Now, going back to the investment thing that we keep on talking about, as you get more commerce involved in this business, maybe you see, an association pop up in DC, and a more coordinated campaign that maybe handles this in a more strategic manner. Maybe I might call it a more responsible manner. But that's something we have to look out for.
Right. I was at a cannabis conference back in 2014. I'm not going to name him by name, but there was a guy who's kind of one of the founding fathers of the cannabis movement. He was an advocate from the beginning, and he's had a tremendous financial success in the industry. But he's on a panel, and the moderator asked each of the 4 or 5 men and women on the panel what his biggest fear was, for the following years in the cannabis industry. And his response was by far the most compelling. And what he said was, I'm afraid that a school bus driver, is going to pop an edible, is going to overconsume, and it's going to drive off a bridge, right? Obviously, that is not like a scare tactic for cannabis, because this guy was very successful in the cannabis industry. What it spoke to was this cataclysmic type of event that can swing you completely lose your momentum at forward progress, and it swings momentum in the exact opposite direction. If this is perceived as being more common and not truly legally problematic in those areas, you really lower the reticence of young people going out and seeking these things out for themselves. And there will be people who, when they're going out there and looking for things, they're going to pick up mistaken mushrooms, as we touched on the last podcast, which can have catastrophic effects. And so that would be my biggest fear moving forward with this, is that you have one of those cataclysmic events where you see all of this very interesting positive momentum kind of get clawed back by a very real negative occurrence that happens out in society as a whole.
Well, this is a fascinating subject, and I know we're going to continue coming back to mushrooms because it really has potential to be the new cannabis in terms of how regulation and deregulation is accomplished state by state, and eventually getting to the federal level, and also in terms of the market opportunity, whether it ends up being a more informal dispensary system or gets gobbled up by major operators and pharmaceuticals. There's going to be a lot of activity here. But moving on, Christian, do you have the shout out of the week for us?
Shout out of the week is unquestionably going to Governor DeSantis and his people. Huge regulated congratulations to how well he and his team handled Hurricane Dorian. Obviously, if you can, we would encourage you to give to the fine people who live in the Bahamas. As you know, if you followed it, you know, Hurricane Dorian basically stopped on top of their home for a full day, and the effects are catastrophic. And you know, Representative Jones has been very forward and on trying to get some money and some aid to the Bahamas. So you know, if you have the opportunity, definitely give. But on a positive note, you know, it's really wonderful to see how, you know, both parties just embraced how well the governor did with this hurricane, and you know, you couldn't ask for a better performance, I think.
Well, yeah, Representative Jones has been a great advocate for the Bahamas. He has family members there. I recommend people who are interested in sort of what he's been doing in ways that you can direct funds to check him out either on Twitter. It's at Chevron Jones, or you can go to his website, chevronjones.com. But, you know, one of the things I think is so impressive is that he immediately, you know, he's one of the leading Democratic members of the legislature, and he immediately put aside sort of political stuff and went to the president and then went to Republican members of the U.S. Senate and started working on solutions, sort of results-oriented solutions to what we could be doing to help the Bahamas. So my understanding is that he's made some, you know, he's accomplished some movement on a federal level there. So that's impressive. So, yeah, great shout out.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Regulated. Find us at regulatedpod.com or at regulatedpod on Twitter.
We'll talk to you next week.